At 9:17 p.m., the American presence in northeastern Syria consisted of 3 forward operating positions and a total of 912 service members spread across terrain that had been contested, then partially stabilized, then contested again through 11 years of civil conflict and the rolling reorganization of every armed faction in the region. The largest of the 3 positions was the garrison at al-Tanf, in the Syrian desert near the Iraqi and Jordanian borders, a strategically positioned installation that sat astride the Baghdad-Damascus highway and served as the primary American counterterrorism platform in the southern Syrian theater. The second was a small support element at Shadadi in Hasaka Governorate, the logistical node that supplied the northeastern positions. The third was a joint coordination outpost with the Syrian Democratic Forces at a position 40 miles east of Deir ez-Zor. 3 positions, 912 Americans, a presence measured not by its size, but by the disproportionate strategic effect it produced, the disruption of IRGC logistics corridors, the degradation of pro-Iran militia supply chains, and the persistent surveillance of the territory through which Iranian proxy forces had moved weapons and personnel between Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon for a decade.
In northern Jordan, at a classified military training facility 70 miles north of Amman, a combined American-Jordanian team of 420 personnel operated the regional training program and the intelligence support element that fed assessment products into the theater's analytical architecture. The facility was not a frontline military position. Its presence was not publicly acknowledged in full. Its contribution to the theater's understanding of Iranian proxy network activity across the Jordan-Syria-Iraq tri-border area was, in the assessment of the theater intelligence community, significant enough that the IRGC Aerospace Force had been attempting to attack it with sufficient accuracy to matter for 14 months.
The IRGC and its proxy network had attempted to coordinate simultaneous attacks on these 4 American positions twice before, once at the beginning of the conflict's 3rd week and once in its 4th. Both attempts had been detected and disrupted through a combination of signals intelligence and human intelligence reporting before execution. The 3rd attempt, being prepared at 9:17 p.m., had been specifically designed to address the detection failures that had doomed the previous 2. Tighter operational security, reduced communications, pre-positioned weapons rather than weapons transported at execution time, and a launch window timed to a gap in the overhead surveillance pattern that the IRGC's planning staff had identified through 18 months of observing American collection architecture rhythms. They had identified a real gap. They had not identified the closure of that gap 4 days before their launch window. The Space Force constellation had been reoriented at the specific request of the theater intelligence community, whose analysis of the evolving IRGC coordination pattern had concluded that the 3rd attempt would use the identified gap. The reorientation had been conducted without any signals that would alert the IRGC's collection against American surveillance practices. The gap existed on the IRGC's model of the surveillance architecture. It did not exist on the actual surveillance architecture at 9:17 p.m. The eastern Syria element of the attack began with 7 IRGC-affiliated militia fighters in 4 pickup trucks who had staged at a position 7 miles east of al-Tanf at 8:30 p.m. They carried a combination of 107mm multiple rocket launchers and a single Falak 2 artillery rocket launcher, a 333mm system with a range sufficient to reach the al-Tanf perimeter from their staging position. The Falak 2 was the new component, the element that had not been used in the previous 2 attempts, added because the IRGC planners had assessed that the garrison's protective architecture was calibrated for the smaller 107mm rocket threat and that a single large caliber system mixed into the salvo would produce terminal effects that the smaller round defenses had not been configured to address. It was a reasonable tactical adjustment. The Falak 2's larger warhead would have produced a more severe impact on the garrison infrastructure than any of the 107mm rounds, if it had fired. The Space Force infrared constellation had been watching the 4 pickup trucks since they left the militia's supply cache at 6:11 p.m. Their route, their staging position, and their orientation, once they stopped and began to set up their launchers, had been transmitted to the Theater Intelligence Fusion Cell at Al-Udeid at 8:44 p.m. The MQ-9 Reaper that was assigned to the al-Tanf Overwatch mission had been redirected to the staging area at 8:46 p.m., its EO/IR sensor confirming the launcher setup by 8:51 p.m. At 8:53 p.m., the targeting data was passed to the 2 AH-64E Apache Guardian attack helicopters that had been on alert at the al-Tanf position since 7 p.m. On alert because the same intelligence assessment that had flagged the gap closure had also flagged the al-Tanf launch window as the most probable initiation point for the third coordinated attack attempt. The militiamen at the staging position believed they had until 9:30 p.m. before American overhead surveillance would cover their position. They had until 9:17 p.m. before the Apaches arrived. The Apaches took off at 9:04 p.m. and flew at low altitude eastward, their navigation following the terrain features that kept them below the visual horizon of any observer at the staging position, until they were close enough that the engagement timeline could be compressed to its minimum. They arrived at engagement range at 9:11 p.m. The lead Apache's TADS/PNVS acquired all 4 trucks and both launcher systems at 9:11 p.m. and 6 seconds, the infrared image sharp in the desert night, the launcher crews visible as thermal signatures moving around their equipment. The crews were in the process of elevating the Falak 2 launcher to its firing angle. The weapon was not yet loaded. It did not have time to be loaded. The first Hellfire fired at 9:11 p.m. and 40 seconds, targeting the Falak 2 launcher vehicle. The second targeted the largest 107mm launcher at 9:11 p.m. and 51 seconds. The engagement was complete at 9:13 p.m. and 9 seconds. All 4 vehicles were total losses of asset. The Falak 2 and both 107mm launchers were destroyed before a single round was fired, 18 minutes before the planned launch time. The militia crew did not survive. The 6 Fateh 110 missiles had been moved to the Iraqi launch position in agricultural vehicles, stored in a barn identified as an IRGC logistics asset 14 months earlier and tracked continuously since. The intelligence about the barn had been verified 3 times in the preceding week, verified because the Night Watch operations cell understood that the asset's value required certainty before the authorization to engage a target on Iraqi territory would be granted by the command authority that had to sign it. The authorization had been granted at 8:14 p.m. The 2 F-35As assigned to the barn had been in their holding orbit since 7:30 p.m. When the Fateh 110's pre-launch alignment systems activated at 9:04 p.m., the final pre-launch emission that the RC-135 rivet joint was waiting for, the confirmation that the weapons were transitioning from stored to launch-ready, the F-35As were already turning toward the barn. The time from activation detection to weapons release was 13 minutes. The time from weapons release to impact was 41 seconds. The time from the IRGC's decision to fire to the destruction of everything they had brought to Iraq to do it was 13 minutes and 41 seconds. The militiamen at the staging position believed they had until 9:30 p.m. before American overhead surveillance would cover their position. They had until 9:11 p.m. before the Apaches arrived. The IRGC's targeting problem for the Jordanian facility had always been its distance from any launch position the IRGC could use without violating Jordanian airspace, a constraint that had forced their targeting staff toward long-range options that compressed the accuracy to a level below what their operational objectives required. Their solution for the third attempt was 6 Fateh 110 ballistic missiles repositioned to a launch position in western Iraq, coordinated with an Iraqi militia faction whose relationship to the IRGC Quds force had been cultivated over 11 months specifically for this purpose. The Fateh 110's range from the western Iraqi launch position to the Jordanian facility was within specification. Its accuracy, circular error probable of 30 meters, was sufficient for the area effect the IRGC needed against an unprotected facility. The missiles had been moved to the Iraqi launch position over a 3-day period ending at 6 p.m. the previous evening, concealed in agricultural vehicles, stored in a barn that had been identified as an IRGC logistics asset 14 months earlier and tracked continuously since. At 9:17 p.m., the 6 Fateh 110 missiles were prepared for launch. The militia launch crew of 11 men had been at the position since 4 p.m. At 9:17 p.m. and 30 seconds, all 6 Fateh 110 missiles were destroyed on the ground by 4 GBU-12. Pavwe 2 laser-guided bombs dropped by 2 F-35. As that had been circling at altitude over the Syrian-Iraqi border region since 7:30 p.m., awaiting precisely this moment. The F-35As had been vectored to the launch position at 9:04 p.m. when the final launch preparation activity, the activation of the Fateh 110's pre-launch alignment system, detectable through its specific electromagnetic emission signature, was confirmed by the signals intelligence sensor aboard an RC-135 rivet joint that had been orbiting the Iraqi-Jordanian approach corridor since 6 p.m. The GBU-12 impacts destroyed all 6 missiles, the launch vehicles, and the barn. The launch crew did not survive. No Fateh 110 was fired. The Jordanian facility was never at risk. The Deir ez-Zor outpost was the third element of the attack. The IRGC's plan had assigned a combined rocket and mortar team to strike the joint coordination position from the south, using a pre-positioned supply of 122mm Grad rockets cached in a building on the outskirts of Hajin that had been identified as a militia supply point 6 months earlier and watched since. The launch crew, 9 militia personnel, had arrived at the cache position at 8 p.m. and had been loading the BM-21 Grad launcher since approximately 8:45 p.m. The Space Force constellation had tracked their movement from their bivouac position to the cache building at 7:58 p.m. and had transmitted the contact to the fusion cell at 8:01 p.m. The fusion cell had updated the targeting data for the Night Watch operations cell, which had been tracking this specific node for 44 days and had a pre-computed targeting solution on the cache building, the approach route, and 3 alternative dispersal positions the militia crew might use if they detected surveillance. An AC-130J Ghostrider gunship operating on the theater overwatch mission had been redirected to the Deir ez-Zor area at 8:22 p.m. It arrived at its engagement orbit at 8:44 p.m. and had been watching the cache building since 8:46 p.m., its sensor suite providing a continuous picture of the 9 militia personnel and the BM-21 launcher. At 9:17 p.m., the same minute that the other 2 elements were being addressed, the Ghostrider's fire control officer confirmed that the BM-21 was oriented, elevated, and in the final loading sequence. He had authority to engage. He engaged at 9:17 p.m. and 11 seconds, the 40mm Bofors cannon delivering a precision burst that impacted the BM-21 launcher directly, detonating the rockets already loaded in the launch tubes in a sympathetic detonation that destroyed the launcher, the vehicle, and the cache building in a single expanding fireball visible for 20 miles in the desert darkness. 1 burst. 9 seconds. Complete. The militia crew did not survive. All 3 Syrian and Iraqi attack elements had been addressed within 37 seconds of each other. The al-Tanf element at 9:11 p.m. preemptively, the Deir ez-Zor element at 9:17 p.m., the Western Iraq Fateh 110 element at 9:17 p.m. and 30 seconds, The 3 planned attacks on American positions in Syria and the 1 planned attack on the Jordanian facility had been eliminated before any weapon was fired at any American position. Not a single rocket, not a single mortar round, not a single Fateh 110 warhead had been released at a target. The 4 American positions had experienced a Tuesday night that was indistinguishable, from the perspective of anyone inside those positions, from any other Tuesday night. The incoming fire sirens had not sounded. The protective shelter protocols had not activated. The 912 Americans in Syria and the 420 in Jordan had not known they were targets. They had not needed to know. The intelligence architecture and the response force that had spent 44 days building toward this moment had known it for them. The response to the attack elements was immediate and addressed both the executed elements and the larger network infrastructure that had organized them. The operation was designated Silent Reckoning. Silent Reckoning had 3 components. The first was the destruction of the physical assets that had been committed to the attack, assets that had been tracked to their current positions, and that, in the case of the weapons and vehicles not yet destroyed, represented resources the network would attempt to recover and reuse. The second was the network infrastructure, the safe houses, the weapons caches, the logistics nodes, and the communications relay points that had connected the 3 Syrian elements and the Iraqi element into the coordinated attack structure. The third component was the IRGC Quds Force coordination element in western Iraq, the small team of IRGC officers who had planned, resourced, and directed the attack operation, whose location had been known for 19 days through human intelligence reporting that had taken 14 months to develop. The Apache Guardians had already addressed the al-Tanf element at 9:11 p.m. Their work at that element was complete. They landed, rearmed, and were back on alert status at the al-Tanf position by 9:44 p.m., ready for any follow-on tasking within the range of their operational radius. The F-35As had addressed the western Iraq element at 9:17 p.m. The Ghostrider had addressed the Deir ez-Zor element at 9:17 p.m. The destroyed equipment and caches were logged as battle damage confirmed. The Night Watch network map had 41 additional aim points beyond the 3 launcher positions that had been addressed at 9:11 p.m. to 9:17 p.m. Weapons caches at 7 locations across the eastern Syria network. 3 militia command posts. 4 logistics relay points that moved weapons, money, and personnel between the IRGC's supply system and the forward militia units. A vehicle pool that had provided the trucks for the al-Tanf element, a communications facility that had relayed the encrypted coordination messages between the attack elements and the IRGC Quds Force team in Iraq. The IRGC Quds Force coordination element itself, 3 officers in a farmhouse compound near the Iraqi city of al-Qaim, whose presence had been confirmed by human intelligence at 4 p.m. The F/A-18F package from the USS Harry S. Truman launched at 9:22 p.m., 5 minutes after the primary attack elements were addressed 26 of the 41 additional aim points between 9:51 p.m. and 10:14 p.m. The strikes followed the sequencing that the Night Watch operations cell had determined would produce the maximum disruption. Weapons caches first, to prevent any attempt to reconstitute attack capability from surviving materials. Command posts second, to remove the personnel and communications infrastructure that would coordinate any reconstitution. Logistics nodes. Third, to sever the supply lines through which any replacement materials would arrive. GBU-39, small diameter bombs against the soft targets, the command posts, the logistics buildings, the vehicle pool. GBU-31 JDAM bombs against the hardened cache positions. 14 minutes of precision strikes against 26 aim points. All 26 assessed as struck. The remaining 15 aim points, the highest density logistics hub in Deir ez-Zor Governorate, 4 additional cache positions that required larger warhead weapons, and the 6 communications relay points distributed across the eastern Syria network, were addressed by the B-1B Lancer package that had been airborne since 7 p.m., its weapons bays loaded with Tightest SSMER cruise missiles and GBU-31J DAM bombs. The B-1Bs reached their release points at 10:09 p.m. and completed their weapons employment at 10:22 p.m. The Deir ez-Zor Logistics Hub, a 2-building compound that had served as the primary pre-positioning site for weapons and materiel moving through the eastern Syria network, received 4 JASM-ER impacts in a time-on-target sequence at 10:11 p.m. The buildings were assessed as non-recoverable. The materiel stored inside them assessed through overhead imagery and signals intelligence as including a significant inventory of rockets, mortar rounds, and small arms, produced secondary explosions that burned for 4 hours and were visible from 40 miles. The IRGC Quds Force Coordination element at Al-Qaim was addressed at 10:17 p.m. by 2 GBU-31J DAM bombs delivered by an F-35A assigned specifically to this aim point. The farmhouse compound was struck. The 3 IRGC officers whose presence had been confirmed at 4 p.m. were assessed as removed from the battle space. With them went the institutional knowledge, the network relationships, and the operational planning that had spent 11 months developing the 3-country attack architecture that had just been comprehensively addressed. The replacement of that capability, the recruitment and development of a new coordination element with the same level of network penetration and operational sophistication would require time measured in months, not days. By 10:44 p.m., the Silent Reckoning post-strike preliminary assessment was complete. The 4 planned attacks on American positions had been preempted. 0 rockets fired, 0 mortars fired, 0 ballistic missiles fired against any American position. 41 additional network infrastructure nodes addressed across Syria and Iraq. The IRGC coordination element eliminated. 3 militia attack crews neutralized before executing. The eastern Syria and western Iraq proxy network's operational capacity assessed as severely degraded, with reconstitution requiring resupply, re-equipping, and the development of new coordination architecture that the available IRGC personnel infrastructure in the theater was not positioned to provide quickly. At the al-Tanf garrison, the overnight watch went through their standard rotation. At the Shaddadi support element, the maintenance crew finished the 3rd item on their evening schedule and moved to the 4th. At the Deir ez-Zor coordination outpost, the 2 analysts still in the operations center completed their shift assessment and sent it to the fusion cell. At the Jordanian facility, the overnight intelligence production cycle ran without interruption, its products feeding into the same theater analytical architecture that had spent 44 days building the targeting picture that had just been used. 912 Americans in Syria, 420 in Jordan. All of them had spent this Tuesday night the way they had spent every other Tuesday night of the deployment, outside, in the eastern Syrian desert and in the farming country west of Al-Qaim. The evidence of the night's work was cooling in the thermal picture that the Space Force constellation was still watching. The burning cache, the destroyed launchers, the farmhouse at Al-Qaim, the 17 separately located fires that the JASSMER and JDAM strikes had produced across the network. The Space Force analyst who had reoriented the constellation 4 days earlier to cover the IRGC's surveillance gap was logging her final entries for the watch period. She noted the preemption count, 4 attack elements addressed before execution. She noted the network count, 41 additional aim points struck. She noted the time of the last confirmed impact, 10:22 p.m. She noted in the observation field that the assessment format provided for additional context, a single sentence. The gap closure worked. It had worked because of the 44 days that had preceded it. 44 days of collection, of cross-referencing, of analytical work that had produced the targeting confidence necessary to authorize engagement of 4 active threat elements simultaneously, and to maintain the discipline to wait for the optimal moment rather than striking prematurely and alerting the network to the extent of American knowledge. The discipline of waiting is the hardest discipline in intelligence work. The knowledge that you know where the threat is, that it is moving toward its execution, that acting too early will disrupt the operation but leave the network intact for a subsequent attempt. The Night Watch operations cell had maintained that discipline through 2 previous detected attempts, declining to expose the full extent of its knowledge each time in order to preserve the collection architecture that would be decisive when the 3rd attempt materialized. The 3rd attempt had materialized. The discipline had been vindicated. In the arithmetic of counter-network operations, the most decisive action is always the one that happens before the attack does.